How I told my sister that I got pregnant by her fiancé. Second part. My father abruptly stood up from the chair, his eyes filled with a rage I had rarely seen. His normally controlled voice was now a contained roar. How did this happen? How could you let this happen, Catherine? Catherine stepped back, clearly frightened by the intensity of his reaction. My mother tried to intervene, but my father continued, his voice full of accusation. I trusted you. I've always done everything for you. And now you ruin everything? The tension in the air was almost palpable. Catherine was in shock, silently crying, while my father paced back and forth, trying to process the situation. And then, amidst the chaos, something I never expected happened. My mother, who had always been the mediator, the peacemaker of the family, exploded in a way I had never seen before. And you think you can judge her? She shouted at my father, her voice trembling with anger and desperation. As if you're the only one who made sacrifices for this family? You want to talk about betrayal? About broken trust? The room fell silent. My father stopped pacing, slowly turning to my mother, his eyes wide with surprise. The anger he felt was now replaced by a look of pure confusion and fear. Catherine and I exchanged a quick glance, not knowing what to expect. Something was about to be revealed, something much bigger than I had imagined. My mother, still shaking, crossed her arms, her eyes shining with a mix of pain and fury. Tell them, Robert. Tell your daughters the truth. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Truth? What truth? Catherine, who had been silent until then, looked at our mother with wide eyes, waiting for an explanation. My father remained silent, his jaw tense, as if he were struggling to hold back something much bigger. What is she saying? I asked, my voice wavering. The growing dread inside me was impossible to ignore. I had already been carrying so much, so many secrets, so many lies, and now it seemed there was something even deeper and darker than I ever imagined. My father looked at my mother, and then, with a heavy sigh, finally began to speak. But his words came out with difficulty. There's something I've hidden from you for a long time, something I thought you'd never need to know. My heart was pounding violently in my chest as he paused. Catherine was beside me, equally tense, waiting for the revelation. And then he dropped the bombshell. I embezzled money from the company. For years. And Catherine? She found out. I tried to fix things, tried to pay back what I took, but it was too deep. Now we're being blackmailed. And if I don't pay, everything will be exposed. My head spun. Embezzlement, blackmail. How did this fit into everything that was happening? I looked at Catherine, but she just lowered her head, clearly devastated. She knew everything. And me? I had no idea. All the time we had been fighting, all the drama between us, there had been something much bigger going on. My father, the man I believed to be upright and strong, was involved in a corruption scandal. My sister, the perfect daughter, knew about it and was helping to cover it up. And I'm pregnant, Dad. Catherine suddenly shouted, interrupting the moment. I can't handle this. I can't deal with all of this alone. The revelation seemed too much for Catherine, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. My father, who until then seemed focused on his own problems, suddenly realized the gravity of the situation for her. He looked at my sister with eyes heavy with guilt, trying to process the extent of his failures. I'm sorry, he stammered, but the pain on his face showed that he knew the words wouldn't be enough. My mother, standing next to him, looked devastated. Their marriage, which I had always believed to be solid, was proving to be as fragile as any other aspect of our family life. And then, amidst all this chaos, my own guilt hit me hard. I was still carrying my own secret. I was also pregnant with Ethan, the same man who had left Catherine in this situation. I knew that any moment, I would need to tell the truth. But how? How could I do this now, with our family crumbling before our eyes? The days that followed were a blur of tension and arguments. My father was desperately trying to find a way to cover the embezzled money before the blackmail was exposed. Catherine was dealing with the pregnancy and the impending end of her relationship with Ethan. I, on the other hand, was on the brink of an emotional collapse, knowing that soon my own bomb would explode too. Our home, which had once been a refuge, had now become a battleground. Our lives were entangled in secrets so deep that I could barely see a way out. The truth had finally come to light, but at what cost? The days that followed the revelation of my father's embezzlement and Catherine's pregnancy brought a sense of constant chaos. The tension inside our house was so heavy, it felt suffocating. Every glance, every unspoken word carried the weight of too many secrets, like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. And amidst all this, I was carrying my own burden. The truth about my pregnancy and the fact that Ethan, Catherine's fiancé, was also the father of my baby. I knew I couldn't keep this a secret for much longer. The time had come to be honest, not just with my family, but also with myself. The weight of guilt was consuming me. Yet something inside me hesitated. Fear. I was so afraid of what this revelation could do to all of us. Catherine was already devastated by her pregnancy. My father was drowning in legal troubles. And my mother, that strong and composed woman who always kept the family together, could barely look at my father without falling apart. Then, the inevitable happened. The morning after a monumental argument between my parents about how to handle the money embezzlement scandal, Catherine came to me. She was pale, with deep dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in days. There was something in her gaze that made me realize she knew I was hiding something too. Maybe she had noticed my growing avoidance or the way I seemed unable to look her in the eye in the past few days. "Chloe," she began, her voice low and hesitant, "we need to talk." I felt my stomach drop. Every part of me wanted to run away, to avoid this conversation at all costs, but I knew I couldn't. I had come too far. "About what?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent, but my voice trembled slightly. She, however, didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't mention it. Catherine sat on the edge of my bed and took a deep breath. For a moment, it seemed like she was choosing her words carefully. "I know you're hiding something, and I'm not just talking about what happened between you and Ethan that night." She paused, her voice cracking slightly as she mentioned his name. "There's more. I feel it." My heart began to race, and for a second I considered lying again, escaping the truth. But something in Catherine's gaze stopped me. She was broken, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her as my sister, the one I used to share everything with. "Catherine," I started, trying to find the words. I'm pregnant." The shock on Catherine's face was immediate. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed to lose her breath. The silence between us was almost unbearable until she finally managed to speak. "What do you mean, pregnant?" Her voice was filled with disbelief and, at the same time, a fear I hadn't expected. I don't know how to tell you this, but I swallowed hard, feeling the tears start to form in my eyes. "The baby is Ethan's." Catherine fell silent. I could see the mix of emotions on her face as she tried to process. Shock, anger, sadness, and perhaps the worst of all, a deep sense of betrayal. For a long moment she just stared at me, as if trying to understand how this could be real. Then, slowly, she stood up, her eyes still fixed on me. You're joking, Chloe?" Her voice was a whisper now, as if she couldn't believe the words coming out of her own mouth. "Ethan, my fiancé, is the father of your baby." I nodded, unable to speak. The tears I had been trying to hold back finally escaped, streaming down my face. Everything was falling apart, just as I had feared. Catherine, my sister, the person I had always shared everything with, was now looking at me like I was a stranger, or worse, an enemy. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, her voice filled with pain. "How could you betray me like this?" "I never meant to hurt you," I shouted, guilt overflowing in every word. "It was a mistake, Catherine. I was so confused, so lost, and he was there, and I couldn't speak anymore." The words felt useless in the face of the pain I saw on her face. Catherine looked at me with a mix of anger and disgust, as if she were trying to decide if there was still something good in me to save. "You've destroyed everything," she said, her voice cold. "Not just my life, but our family." "And why? Because of one night?" "It wasn't just one night," I murmured almost inaudibly. I love him. That was the last straw." Catherine took a step back, as if my words had hit her physically. "You what?" I hadn't planned to say that. It wasn't something I had consciously decided to admit, but once the words came out, I knew they were true. I loved Ethan. Maybe I had always loved him, even when he was still with Catherine. I know that doesn't excuse what I did. "But it's the truth," I said, desperately trying to make her understand. "I never wanted this to happen. I tried to fight against these feelings, but I couldn't." Catherine stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something change in her eyes. Maybe it was the recognition that, no matter how painful it was, the truth was there, raw and naked. There were no more lies to tell. And somehow that was the most devastating part. "I can't do this," she finally whispered, retreating toward the door. "I can't deal with this right now." She left the room without saying anything else. And I stood there, alone, feeling the weight of everything crumbling around me. In the following days, Catherine avoided looking at me, talking to me, or even being in the same room. My mother, for her part, seemed to sense that something even bigger was happening. But with all the chaos surrounding my father, she didn't have the strength to investigate further. And Ethan? I barely saw him. He was also drowning in the mess he had created, caught between his responsibility to Catherine and the guilt of the betrayal. The situation with my father quickly worsened. The blackmail threats were becoming more frequent and aggressive. And amid all this, my mother was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She could hardly sleep, worried about the consequences of my father's actions and the future of our family. And then, in the midst of all this chaos, something surprising happened. One day, when I came home from school, I found Catherine sitting alone on the living room sofa. She no longer seemed furious or devastated like before, but tired, as if she had accepted something within herself. I approached cautiously, not knowing what to expect. "Catherine?" I called, my voice hesitant. She looked up at me, and for the first time in days, her eyes were not filled with hate. There was something different, perhaps a kind of resignation, maybe even understanding. "We need to talk," she said calmly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a thread of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to fix things between us. She made me sit beside her and without beating around the bush, began to speak. "I'm not gonna lie, Chloe. What you did hurt me more than anything in life. Ethan, he was the great love of my life. And now, I don't know what to think about him, about us, about the future. But..." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I realize that fighting against this, against you, won't change what has already happened." I stayed silent, absorbing her words. They were heavy with pain, but also with an acceptance I hadn't expected. "What I want to know is, what are you going to do now?" Catherine asked, her eyes fixed on mine. "Because, despite everything, we are still sisters, and whatever happens from here on out, I need to know that I can trust you again." Her words hit me deeply. As much as I had betrayed her trust in an irreparable way, Catherine was still willing to try to find a way to move forward. I knew that nothing would be easy from here on out, but maybe together we could find a path to rebuild our lives and our relationship. And so, there, in that moment, began what I hoped would be a new beginning. Maybe not what I had dreamed of, nor what Catherine had planned, but a beginning nonetheless. After that difficult conversation, I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but at the same time, the future was still an unknown. Catherine and I had not fully reconciled. It would take time, perhaps years, to heal the wounds that our actions and decisions had opened. However, there was a new kind of understanding between us, an acceptance that somehow we would need to learn to coexist with the chaos we had created. In the following days, things began to move quickly. My mother, who was emotionally at her limit, finally made the decision that would change the course of our lives. She was tired of lies, of blackmail, and of the tension surrounding our father. With tears in her eyes, she gathered me, Catherine, and my father in the living room for a definitive conversation. "I can't live like this anymore," she said, her voice wavering. "The lies, the stress, the constant fear that everything will fall apart. This is not life. It's not what I envisioned for us when we started this family." My father, weighed down by the burden of his own choices, remained silent. For the first time, it seemed he truly understood how serious the situation had become. "I'm going to file for divorce," my mother announced, finally letting out the words that had clearly been weighing on her for some time. Catherine and I exchanged glances. Although nothing had been said before, we knew this moment was coming. The pain in my mother's eyes was evident, but there was also a determination I hadn't seen in her for a long time. She was finally taking control of her life, something that, in a way, inspired me. The days that followed were a whirlwind of changes. The divorce, although painful, brought a strange sense of relief to everyone. My father, involved in a complicated legal process due to embezzlement at his company, began to spend less and less time at home. This gave us the space we needed to start rebuilding our lives without the constant tension and fear of more shocking revelations. Meanwhile, life went on, and I knew I had to make serious decisions about my own future. Ethan, who had temporarily disappeared after our confession, finally returned to face the situation. He seemed different, more serious, more aware of the consequences of his actions. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he said one day when we met in the park for a conversation. "And I know I can't fix everything, but I want to try to do the right thing moving forward." I didn't know if I was ready to forgive him for everything, but the truth was, there was something between us that I couldn't ignore. Moreover, there was now a child at stake, and I couldn't simply cut Ethan out of our lives without carefully considering the consequences. "I don't know what the future holds for us," I replied, being as honest as I could. "But what I know is that we need to be responsible parents. We can't let our complications affect the baby." Ethan nodded, seeming calmer than I expected. It had taken time, but it seemed he was willing to take on his responsibilities in a mature way. Even though we didn't know how our relationship would be moving forward, we agreed that we would do whatever it took to ensure our child's well-being. Catherine, for her part, was also facing her own battles. After breaking off her engagement to Ethan, she went through a difficult phase of isolation. No matter how much I tried to reach out to offer support, she preferred to distance herself, perhaps as a way to process everything that had happened. However, over time, she began to find her own strength. Slowly, she started planning her life without Ethan. Even while pregnant, Catherine made the brave decision to move forward on her own, without relying on him. She began researching universities that accepted pregnant students and looking for ways to secure a scholarship. As painful as the end of the relationship was, Catherine was determined to secure a future for herself and her child, without depending on anyone. And so, our lives took different directions, but with an inevitable intersection: motherhood. Catherine and I grew closer through our shared experiences. While our stories were filled with pain and betrayal, there was something profound in knowing that we were both dealing with the same struggles, and in a way that brought us together. A new home. With the divorce finally finalized and my mother seeking to rebuild her own life, we decided it was time to move. The house where we grew up, once filled with happy memories, now felt like a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. We decided to sell the house and look for a new home. Something smaller, simpler, but that would give us the chance to start anew. Catherine and I moved in with my mother in a small apartment in the city center. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough for us. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of calm, even though life was still uncertain. Catherine and I helped each other through our pregnancies, going to doctor's appointments together and supporting one another in moments of weakness. It was strange how circumstances brought us back together after we had drifted so far apart. Now, we were two sisters, each carrying a child and trying to figure out how to be mothers, how to be better versions of ourselves. My mother, who was also dealing with her own pain after the divorce, showed a strength I didn't expect. Although she was devastated at first, she found solace in supporting us, and gradually the strong woman I had always admired began to emerge again. She got a job as an art teacher at a local school and started to create a new circle of friends, building an independent life for the first time in decades. The months passed quickly. As the due dates for our babies approached, the feeling of panic and anxiety grew, but there was also an underlying excitement, the promise of a future that, although uncertain, had the potential to be better. Finally, the day arrived. First it was Catherine. Her labor was complicated, but she gave birth to a beautiful girl, whom she named Lily. When I saw Catherine holding her daughter for the first time, something inside me changed. All the rivalry, all the pain of the past seemed to dissolve. Watching my sister transform into a mother brought a sense of healing that I didn't expect. She, who had always been strong and determined, was now vulnerable and filled with love for that little being she had brought into the world. Shortly after, it was my turn. When I held my son in my arms for the first time, I felt a wave of emotion that was impossible to describe. He was perfect. And in that moment, I knew that regardless of all the difficulties I had faced, of all the lies and betrayals, he was my new beginning. Ethan was there, nervous and emotional. Although our relationship was still uncertain, he was determined to be a good father. We both knew we still had a lot to work out between us. But at least in one regard, we were aligned, putting our child first. Catherine and I supported each other during the first months of motherhood. I knew it would never be easy, but there was something beautiful about sharing this journey with her. Our scars, both physical and emotional, were now part of who we were, but they no longer defined us. The future was still a great unknown. Ethan and I were in a complicated place, trying to figure out how to be parents, while dealing with the confusing feelings that still existed between us. My mother, finally finding peace in her new life, was blossoming in ways I never imagined. And Catherine, with her daughter in her arms, was ready to face the world on her own. However, as uncertain as the future was, one thing was clear. We were all ready to start over. We had our mistakes, our falls, our betrayals, but now we had a new chance to build something different, something better. What began as a story of lies, secrets, and betrayals transformed into something unexpected. My relationship with Catherine, which had been torn apart by so much hurt, was now strengthening, and together we began to chart a new path. Our children were the symbol of a fresh start. It may not have been the happy ending we once dreamed of, but it was real, and that was enough. With our children in our arms and our visible scars, we were ready to face whatever the future held for us. Because in the end, life always finds a way to move forward, and now we were willing to walk side by side, united, as we should have been from the beginning. The price of lies and betrayals was high, but in the end, what truly mattered was what we were willing to do with what remained of us. What would unite us was the strength of our love and the determination to be better, not just for ourselves, but also for the new lives we brought into the world. And so we began to write a new chapter, not just in our lives, but also in the story of our family. A story that was now filled with love, hope, and the promise of a better future. Watch the video that is appearing on your screen, and remember to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving more stories. We will see you in a few seconds.